Hi, good morning, and thank you very much for coming, for joining this very exciting session with a very challenging title, Disinformation, Fake News, and Climate Change Denialism. I think that this is an issue very, very relevant, perhaps too much relevant or not so much relevant sometimes. So I think this is very important that we devote some time to reflect on that, and we are very lucky to have here important journalist, but also the Secretary of State for Global Spain, Irene Lozano, and I would like to give the floor to her, and I'm looking forward to listening to you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome here to this panel. We're going to tackle an issue that I think is very, very important when we speak about climate change. First of all, I will make some remarks very briefly, then I will introduce you to the panelists, and then they will make, each of them will make their own remarks, and then we'll have a debate that I hope is, I'm sure it will be live, dynamic and fluid. To begin with, I want to make a reflection about the motto of this COP. The motto is time for action. And if one thinks about what does it mean, it certainly means we are in an emergency. It conveys the meaning that we are in a hurry. Time for action suggests that we have to act right now. So my question is, why are we in a hurry? Why are we in an emergency? If all the knowledge about climate change, all its impact, its consequences, we have been aware of them for decades. It was in 1988 when the IPCC started providing scientific information on the global warming and its consequences. It was in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was signed. That is more than 30 years and more than 20 years. So why are we in a hurry now? I mean, it was time for action in 1998, 1999, 2000. And the reason why we are in a hurry now is because of denialism of climate change. If we had started taking the appropriate measures 20 years ago, 30 years ago, now we wouldn't say time for action. We wouldn't say we are in an emergency. So the direct responsibles for this emergency are the people who have led what I would call the biggest global disinformation campaign. And what have been the consequences of this disinformation campaign? Well, when they have spread confusion in the public opinion, what the people have done is not to put enough pressure on politicians, on economic and entrepreneurial leaders. And this is what has made that all the decisions, all the policies on climate change have been delayed, and we have not advanced as much as we should have done. So my conclusion is that disinformation and denialism is a great danger. Of course, we can see it in the climate change issue, but we can see it on other issues. The disinformation on climate change started when the social media didn't exist. So it was much more expensive in the beginning, but actually many millions of dollars were ready to fund this campaign through the years. Nowadays, it's cheaper, it's easier to reach people with false narratives about climate change, and they are still circulating on the digital sphere, on the digital world. About all these issues, we have four panelists that are going to tackle all the different aspects of this denialism. And now I would like to introduce you to all of them. First of all, to my right, I have Richard Black. He's the director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, whose core work is to ensure that discourse in the UK on climate change and the energy transition is rooted in evidence. So as you can see he's a great expert on the issue. He has a very impressive career, but I will only say a couple of things. He has worked for the BBC World Service, and in last year he wrote the book Denied: The Rise and Fall of Climate Contrarianism, the only book about the UK's climate contrarian elite. It is a book that I have read myself and that I recommend. Then we have Berna González Harbour. She's a writer, a journalist, a political analyst and cultural collaborator. She's currently the deputy director of El País newspaper, where she was previously posted as head of opinion op-ed section. She has a very long career as journalist in El País, which is the main Spanish newspaper. And she also regularly participates in the Spanish most listened morning radio program Hoy por Hoy, Cadena Ser. Thank you, Berna, for joining us. Then I have here next to me, next to my right, to my left, Stefan Lewandowski. He's a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol. He has published more than 200 scholarly articles, chapters, and books, including numerous papers on how people respond to corrections of misinformation. So he's going to give us a very interesting perspective on the psychological and cognitive aspect of disinformation. His most recent research interests examine the potential conflict between human cognition and the physics of the global climate. He has contributed around 50 opinion pieces to the global media on issues related to climate change skepticism. And finally, we have Paul Thacker. He's a journalist based out of Madrid and a former fellow at the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. For several years, he led a series of high-profile investigations in the United States Senate, and he has written on scientific ethics and disinformation for numerous outlets, including New York Times, Huffington Post, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and many others. So as you can see, we're going to listen to all of them. I'm sure their different perspectives are going to be very interesting. And now I give the floor to Richard, sorry. Richard.
Thank you, Secretary.
Please.
Thank you, Secretary of State, and thanks very much for having me here. It's a great privilege. So I'm a former journalist. I worked for the BBC for years with BBC News, and so as long as I was covering climate change, there was fake news. I'm one of only 2 environment journalists in the world, I think, to have had a blog set up that attacks me, specifically to attack me, the other being Alistair Doyle of Reuters, and I wear that like a badge of honour. So fake news has been around as long as we have had news. In the early days of British papers, it was all about fake crime stories, sexy stories with scandal and intrigue that would sell papers. And I'm sure if you went back to Roman times, you would probably find fake news there as well. And it's rather ironic now that when in this era of social media and Facebook and so on, that you have newspaper editors sometimes complaining about these new outlets and how there are no editorial standards. These are the same papers that used to tell us that a new ice age was coming and that we were fine and that wind turbines would never work. So they really don't have a distinguished history in this at all. Just a little word on nomenclature and names. We were talking about this a little bit backstage beforehand. Denial, skepticism, I think both of those terms have their problems. In my book, which the Secretary of State kindly alluded to recently, I use the term contrarian because I think that not only do these people select a whole range of things to argue with, but there's also a kind of intellectual arrogance that takes pride in being different. You know, I'm an expert and I know a lot, so I think differently, and because I'm always right, I'm right about this. It's an extraordinary phenomenon, really, and there is psychology on this, which Steve will probably know far better than I. And the point is about these people is that they don't only talk about climate change. So the arguments are not only that climate change isn't happening or climate change won't be as bad as scientists say it is. It's also about the energy transition. It will cost too much. If we just use renewable energy, electricity supply will be unreliable. And that sort of argument, I think, has more traction with politicians than the climate change arguments. Because if you are in government when your country has power cut after power cut after power cut, you will lose your office. But to be wrong on climate change, well, we might not see actually the effects of that for 10 or 20 or so years. So we've got all these different types of argument that are deployed in climate change contrarianism. And there's a new one, which I think is copyrighted in Australia by Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister. I don't know if there are any Australians here. Excellent. It's all right, you're forgiven. We've got nothing to be proud of either. But it's a new argument that says, yeah, climate change is real, we accept the science, but actually these heat waves that we're having, these bushfires, that's nothing to do with it. It's an extraordinary thing. It's like, being in a room full of smokers and saying, yeah, I know smoking makes us ill, but this lung disease I'm having, that's nothing to do with smoking, nothing to do with me. It's an extraordinary thing. So we've seen this, and some of it is paid, and we know that, and organisations like DeSmog and Inside Climate News have done an amazing job in uncovering some of the history of paid climate denial. In the UK, it's not primarily been funded. It's primarily been an ideological position which is founded in a distaste for regulation, a belief in the purity of the free market, and which has also, as I said, got this hint before of intellectual arrogance that I'm right, and it's good to think differently, so I'll think differently. One of the main UK contrarians even said a few years ago, when he was supporting free speech, he said, the right to free speech includes the right to say things that are not true. An extraordinary statement for someone who otherwise poses as being credible and a scientist, basically. So I've got some good news, which I come to at the end of my book. And the good news is that in the UK, at least, they've lost. And we've seen that in the history of my organisation. 5 years ago, when we started, a fairly senior Conservative MP made a big public splash arguing that the UK should scrap the Climate Change Act, which we've had for 10 years. The UK was the first country in the world to have a climate change law. And his argument was that if we had the Climate Change Act, we would have power cuts, we couldn't afford it, no other country would do anything on climate change. And this argument had a lot of traction in the media and in Conservative politics. Fast forward now, we have a Conservative government still, which has introduced a net zero target, which is now taking pride in hosting next year's UN climate conference, and where there is now a race among politicians in the UK to see who can be the greenest. And why has that happened? I think for three main reasons. The main one is that they've been shown to be wrong about pretty much all of their arguments. The second one is that they were clearly out of touch, that the newspapers that were advancing these arguments, editors have come to realise that this is not where their public is. The public does not accept these arguments. And so it's been about, my readers don't like this, so I'll take another editorial line. And the third thing is, frankly, that some of these people are not very nice. They're generally elderly white men, and the levels of sexism which they produce are extraordinary. And this is just something that you just can't do. I'm very grateful for this in 2019. So we still wait in the UK to translate this change in the mood in politics into actual concrete action in reducing emissions, and that's the next step. But at least of the level of political rhetoric, the argument is over. And perhaps just conclude with one final point, that in the UK, this has never been about the public. The public mood has remained supporting action on renewable energy, believing that climate change is a problem. What the contrarians did was persuade politicians that the public didn't think that. They persuaded the politicians that people didn't like wind turbines and didn't like solar panels and weren't concerned about it. It was the fakest of fake news, and it's been exposed for what it is, and they've lost. Thank you.
Well, that's good news. Thank you, Richard. How about Spain, perhaps, Berna? You can tell us, have they won or lost in Spain?
And thank you for this invitation to share this panel that is so interesting, much more than what I'm sure. I am an expert in journalism, not in fake news, but I think that leads me to the following words. As far as I think you are not Spanish, much of you, I would like to remember what happened in Spain with the fake news. Mariano Rajoy was president for the last years before our actual president, Pedro Sánchez, and when he was just the president of the Popular Party in 2007, he was very skeptical towards the climate change, and he even used this argument. He said his cousin, who was a professor of physics in Sevilla, told him, "Oh, if we can't predict the rain, the weather tomorrow in Sevilla, how can we predict the climate change?" And that's the argument he used to defend that it wasn't so important, climate change. This is real. This is the person that became president of the government some years later. He actually changed, and he admitted his mistake, and he started to plan a law on climate change. But look at what disgrace we have in Spain, which is like the disgrace that we can have in Brazil or the United States. Is the disgrace that the president has the wrong cousin, or that we have the wrong president? Excuse me if I am very radical or extreme in my argument. As I've said, he changed later on. But what I want to say is that the problem is not the people that make fake news. The problem is that the leaders who use these fake news to support some politics. That's the problem. As I say, he later changed. Now we have Vox. Vox is an extreme right party who has jumped from 27, I think, members in the Congress to 52 in last elections a month ago. This party is denialist, and it has provoked things like the next one that I'm going to explain. We had some fires also in Canary Islands who were linked to the temporary phenomena, the weather phenomena linked to the climate change. And the Senate in Spain was going to approve a motion to condemn this what happened. And he provoked a cancellation of this declaration because he said there was a mention of the climate change, and that Vox thinks that's retórica progresista, which means progressive or liberal rhetoric. So they are linking, Vox is linking the climate change, the speech about climate change, the narrative, to the progressive ideas, which is so far from the reality. So, of course, we have very good news. In Spain, 93% of the population believe that the climate change is a fact, and that the human action has caused the climate change. We published a poll on Sunday in El País, which, if you are interested, I invited you to read, because it has many aspects about more of 50% of the population are ready to pay taxes about, or the majority thinks it's very urgent or almost enough urgent to make radical plans. So, I mean, the population here, as in other aspects of the social affairs, are have gone farther than the governments. Governments sometimes go slower than the population, of course, maybe because of the economical interest of big companies. So as I was saying, problem is not the fake news. Problem is the populist use of the fake news from the leaders. At this time, I would like to share with you an audio. Let's see if it works. I don't know if you heard about Donald Trump's words tonight in the United States. I will try to share them with you. He's talking about climate change and will let hear him. Well, no?
Se corta cuando lo
No, we don't hear. Oh, you must look for it. It's a shame. We will try again. No, sorry. Oh. No, sorry. Okay, look for it. It's very interesting. I'm sorry, in all newspapers you can find it. He was talking to his Republican people, and he was saying, imagine that they win, the climate change people. We will have windmills all through the United States, and I will tell my wife at night, oh, I want to see TV. Oh, we can't because there is no wind, because windmills are not working. So I'm afraid we have no TV tonight. Oh, these climate change people who are against the modernity and who think that war will go 3 millimeters in 250 years and they win. So he's ridiculizing the climate change. I invite you to look for it. It's really very interesting. So just to end and let my colleagues of the panel, I just want to end with the same words. The problem is not the fake news. The problem is the use the leaders are doing of this fake news. That's irresponsible, immoral, unethical, and lessive for our future. Thank you.
So, Stephen, what can you tell us about this?
Well, that was wonderful. I think the stage has been set for by the two of you for the kind of research that I can talk about, which I've been doing for 15 years now, and that is to understand why it is that people listen to leaders like that, and why they're susceptible to fake news, because that's one thing that is worth understanding. And it turns out that when you look at the variables that are driving people's attitudes towards science, the number one factor, the biggest factor, the elephant in the room, is their political ideology. And I can ask people 4 questions about the free market. I can just say things to them, do you think that unregulated business is the best way to supply people with food and goods? And if they say, oh yeah, and they strongly agree with that, 4 questions like that, then I pretty much know their attitudes towards the laws of physics as far as climate change is concerned. Because people who endorse free markets, who are extreme adherents to the idea of free markets and business and free enterprise, they're very likely to say that climate change doesn't exist or is a hoax. And so there's an incredibly strong link there. And it isn't just politics in the conventional sense. It is deeply emotional. The people who I'm talking about here are deeply vested in this idea of free markets. It's more than a political attitude. It's a very, it's part of their identity. And that is why they feel threatened, not by climate change, but by the response to climate change. So if we're saying, oh, we got to cut emissions, the moment you say that, they say, my God, that's interfering with the free market. The only time you can use the word cut is in the context of tax cut. but nothing else must be cut. No emissions, no interference. And so that's when people get very emotional about it. And the moment they are put in this conflict between their emotional commitment to the free markets and what is happening in reality, they resolve the conflict by escaping into denial. And they will then use their considerable, sometimes, you know, these are clever people sometimes. They will use their considerable intellectual capacity to find ways in which to avoid the overwhelming evidence. And that's when things get to be interesting for me from a scientific point of view, to understand and explain how people do that. And so, for example, a lot of people will resort to conspiracy theories. They will just say, oh, the scientists, yeah, well, they're all agreeing on this because they're out to form the world government, or they're in it for the money, or they're pursuing Al Gore's agenda. They're all liberals, all these geophysicists, you know, they're in it to go after grant money, etc., etc. So people will resort to conspiracy to explain away the scientific consensus. And then they will play these games, these wonderful games of cherry-picking data. So they will find one thermometer in the middle of Spain that's cooled down for the last 2 years. And they will then say, see, global warming is a hoax, because there's this one observation that goes the other way, while they ignore everything else. And it's vaguely important, I think, to understand that for the public, that it is very easy for contrarians or deniers to create plausible sounding rhetoric, because if you don't know the science, they can come up with talking points that at first glance sound plausible. Like in the Barents Sea, Arctic ice hasn't declined in the last 3 years. Quite on the contrary, it's increased. Well, that sounds kind of plausible, until you work out that the Barents Sea is a tiny aspect, you know, a tiny part of the Arctic, and that they're totally ignoring everything else, where of course the ice is melting. So those are the kind of things that deniers engage in, and it is important to understand the fallacies that are underlying their arguments, so we can deal with that. And it turns out that some of my research shows that if you explain these fallacious arguments to people, that they then sometimes become more resistant to being misled by climate deniers. So, and that is a role, for example, the media could take by explaining how the public is being misled by deniers. Now, I want to end on a positive note, I guess, because if you look at the history of denial, which isn't just climate, 30 years ago it was tobacco. Some people on behalf of the tobacco industry denied the link between smoking and lung cancer. And then we had ozone hole denial. And then we had this denial and that denial, and now we have climate denial. Well, if you look at the past, then one of the encouraging things is that we started dealing with tobacco and got tobacco under control, even at a time when there was a small vocal minority pumping out this nonsense about tobacco not being bad for you. So politically, I think, the political will can exist to deal with climate change without us having to worry about the relatively small number of people that are sprouting this nonsense out there. So, and I'm hoping that we're at that point in history now where we have that commitment, and looking at the world and Greta and everything else that's happening, I'm actually quite optimistic that we're at that tipping point.
Thank you. So it's your turn.
Can you hear me? I just want to say that, like, I've always noticed that a libertarian think tank requires huge infusions of corporate cash to prop up their free market ideas. And I've been told that's giving the invisible hands of the economy a very visible middle finger. Like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Levi Jeans, scientific disinformation is an iconic American product. It was created back in the 1950s when the tobacco companies hired a PR firm to counter growing evidence on the health effects of tobacco. This PR firm created disinformation by embracing skepticism and co-opting academic researchers, funding nonprofits, undermining independent researchers, and providing canned quotes from independent scientists to journalists. These policies continue today. For example, in 1979, the head of communications at the FDA told People magazine, "The American Council on Science and Health just makes blanket endorsements of food additives. The organization is a sham, an industry front." But in 1997, the Global Climate Coalition, which targeted the IPCC, funded the American Council on Science and Health to write a paper that denigrated climate modeling, downplayed climate health problems, and highlighted dissenting opinions. In 2013, Mother Jones reported on leaked documents showing that the ACSH's funders included Chevron, Coca-Cola, Bayer Crop Science, McDonald's, and the tobacco conglomerate Altria. Documents from a court case show that Monsanto began funding ACSH in 2015 to attack the World Health Organization's cancer agency, scientists, journalists, and nonprofits critical of GMOs and the pesticide glyphosate. When the ACSH launched their new book on junk science in 2017, one of the speakers that day was Nina Fedoroff, the former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the world's largest science society, and a lobbyist for the biotech industry. In the last 2 years, ExxonMobil Foundation provided grants to ACSH, which has defended fracking, denied the dangers of chemicals such as bisphenol A, and opposed efforts to limit sugar in sodas. Many of their members of the ACSH are prominent academic researchers at universities across the globe. ACSH has overlapping membership with various skeptic groups, such as the Committee on Skeptical Inquiry, a pro-science group whose members attack epidemiology and toxicology, showing the dangers of chemicals and pesticides. Not surprisingly, documents show that the agrochemical industry's strategy to promote their products was called embracing skepticism, an approach created by the tobacco companies. Former speakers at the committee's annual meeting include the Cybabe, who has been a sponsored speaker of Monsanto and now promotes Splenda. Their podcast is run by Kevin Senapathy, who is promoted on the website of Monsanto and CropLife, the lobbying group for pesticides. In 2006, I reported on a pro-science group called the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition, or TASC, and had to call several of their members, prominent scientists, some of them members of the national academies, and inform them that TASC had been started by a law firm working with the tobacco companies to downplay the dangers of secondhand smoke. I later reported that TASC's director, Stephen J. Malloy, Mr. Junk Science, was on the payroll of the tobacco industry and attacked researchers working on climate change and the dangers of pharmaceuticals such as Vioxx. To be clear, researchers working on climate are some of the worst when it comes to denial. They admit that climate science is real, but they deny the peer-reviewed research going back decades showing that money buys influence. As reported by 2 young scholars in The Guardian, the fossil fuel industry has colonized academia. Shell, Chevron, BP, and other oil and gas companies fund Harvard's energy and climate policy research, and Harvard researchers consult for industry. MIT's energy initiative is funded almost entirely by fossil fuel companies, and MIT has taken $185 million from climate denialist David Koch. Stanford's Global Climate Energy Project is funded by ExxonMobil, and UC Berkeley's Energy Bioscience Institute is funded by BP. Again, this is not a new strategy. The tobacco companies began funding universities back in the 1950s to buy similar acquiescence, access to universities, brand building, and to tame outspoken researchers. If you think the answer is journalism, think again. A senior employee at the ACSH is on the board of USA Today and regularly writes op-eds for them. In the last couple of years, I've reported for the BMJ on educational programs for reporters that were secretly funded by Coca-Cola to shift the discussion on obesity away from sugary drinks to lack of exercise. And the agrochemical industry has funded a series of biotech boot camps to teach reporters about GMOs and pesticides. Studies have found that journalists' love of controversy causes them to give equal sides in scientific debates, even when evidence lands in one direction. And journalists rarely report on their sources' financial conflicts of interest. Perhaps the only tiny light comes from medicine. Both the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA instituted reforms to financial conflicts of interest in the mid-'80s, but the 2 leading science journals did not catch up until 1992 with Science and 2001 with Nature. Yet, highlighting financial influence is critical. Besides climate change, researchers have documented corporate influence skewing science in food, synthetic chemicals, risk analysis, pesticides, air pollution, and genetic technology. Unlike medicine, these areas of science do not have the same volume of peer-reviewed literature documenting corporate influence on universities, professors, and published studies. The National Academies in 2009 released a report documenting corporate influence on medicine and how this alters the care of patients. The following year, Congress passed a small provision that I initially drafted and then worked for years to pass as a Senate investigator called the Physician Payment Sunshine Act. This requires companies to report when they give monies to doctors. Similar bills have been passed in several other countries, although nothing close to this exists for other areas of science. Indeed, medicine is light years ahead of the rest of science. In one example, the New York Times published a front-page story documenting a cancer researcher's failure to disclose his financial ties to industry. That physician resigned from Memorial Sloan Kettering a week later. And a second example, the New York Times published a front-page story exposing Florida professor Kevin Folta's ties to Monsanto. Instead of apologizing, he sued the newspaper, a case the judge later dismissed with prejudice. He has gone on to host talks at several pro-science groups, such as the Committee on Skeptical Inquiry and other organizations. One of the most important tools we have are the courts in America. Nothing changed with tobacco until the companies were sued, forcing their documents and emails into the light of day. At this time, lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry, opioid companies, and Monsanto are shining a light on corporate strategies to create scientific disinformation. In the case of Monsanto, these documents have helped to change the EU's guidance on pesticides in Brussels and will require companies to disclose their data when applying for pesticide registration. 3 points remain important for anyone who wants to try to understand scientific controversy and disinformation. Number one, follow the money. If you think that everything you need to know is found in the pages of the research literature, you still lack an adult understanding of how science works. Number two, name and shame. It's a basic principle of journalism. The trains didn't run on time by themselves. People made the trains run on time. And number three, show me the documents. I can't tell you the number of academics that I've gotten fired from prominent universities in the United States or required to step down as chairman of various departments. Do not be fooled by someone's title. For too long, these corporate strategies of co-op science have proven successful in confusing the public and legislators about the safety and health of products. We know this from tobacco. We're continuing to learn about this more from other areas of science. We need to stop making the same mistakes. Thanks so much.
Well, in a few minutes, I will give you the floor to make some questions to the panelists. But first of all, let me lead a short debate between the four of you. I am very interested on the idea that people believe, some of you said it, several people believe against science, so to speak, because of their ideology. What I find very disturbing is that, of course, you have an ideology, you have a cosmovision, you have your ideas on policies, on how the world should be, but you don't have the right to your own facts, so to speak. You have the right to your ideas, of course, you have the right to your opinions, but we don't have the right to our own facts, because even if you are a believer on the free market, I find very difficult that you can defend free market against what science is saying. So for me, the most disturbing thing of this climate change denialism is how can we completely, or can some people, the denialists, completely forget the evidence and not only have their own ideology, but create their own fictional world where climate change simply is not going to happen. So how can we think like that?
Well, human beings are extremely good at believing what they want to believe in the light of evidence. And, and as I said, they cherry pick, they accuse scientists of a conspiracy, they will resort to anything they can resort to undermine the evidence. I mean, I know people, I've heard people, I've seen people who deny that thermometers can measure temperature accurately, right? I mean, they will say things like, oh, you never know when these thermometers were read. Maybe it was in the morning, maybe it's at lunchtime, and therefore we have global warming because the guy who's measuring temperature in the middle of Australia is getting up later in the day. It's kind of like, are you for real? But yeah, they're for real. The people think like that. They will invent ways not to have to accept facts. And of course, these days, we have to look at the larger context of Donald Trump, who will call anything fake news that he doesn't like. And so part of the problem we're having right now is that saying that something is a fact or that something is evidence is a very challenging thing to begin with, because we have this sort of post-truth syndrome where politicians think they can just make up their own stuff. And it isn't just Donald Trump. I can think of another dude with blonde hair in the United Kingdom who, if anything, is even better than Donald Trump at distorting reality.
Yes, I actually was thinking about Boris Johnson. That's the one, the blonde hair, because it's true what you all say. Truth is not important anymore.
Exactly.
It seems. And we have plenty of examples, not only the climate change. Now, I was thinking in Brexit as well. We have seen in these 3 years and last years, and the British people could see it, that all these lies that they said about the money that they gave to Europe, about all the hostile things that they think they came from Europe, they are lies. They've seen it. That there are committees that have demonstrated that is not true. But it's not important. We can see in the last polls that people are thinking, no, we know that he lies. We know that he's like that. He has all these defects, but we want him and we want Brexit. So truth is not important. Another question is that the empirism is coming into the scenario, and I explain myself. People now are feeling that the climate change is real because they are feeling the hot temperatures. In Spain, we are feeling them. We are seeing Venezia with floods every 5 minutes. In Canary Islands, in California, in Amazonia. Well, there are other aspects there, but people are feeling here in Spain, for example, we had floods in Murcia, and a week later, in Mar Menor, which is a small sea in this coast, we had tons of dead fish in the sand, no? And it was caused because all this flood and the mixture of the waters, etc. So people now are feeling in their bodies that the heat is here, etc. This is dangerous because then there is a Republican who tweets, "Oh, look, it's cold in New York."
Yes.
In New York, and they show a photo of the cold, and they said, "And where is the climate change?" So it's dangerous, the empirism. But I think it's here. We have noticed, but yes, the problem is that the truth is out there, like this series used to say, but we don't want the truth.
Yeah, I've just got sort of 3 quick reflections on that, if I may. One is to pick up on something that Steve mentioned, which is the simplicity of the messages that many of the contrarians put over. And if you think about the most effective political slogans of recent times, they've all been effective, they've all been simple. So Barack Obama's "Yes, we can." The Brexit slogan, "Take back control." These are very simple things that the minute you dive into them, you see that actually the underlying thing is far more complex. But these things stick in people's minds, and they sound good. And many of the contrarians' arguments are the same. What happens when the wind doesn't blow? Well, it takes quite a long time to explain about the flexible grid and battery storage and all this kind of stuff. And maybe climate change won't be so bad. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe it won't. It's kind of true because we don't really know how bad it will be. But of course, there's a whole, the counter argument is so much more complex. So that's one. Another one is the public doesn't know what the public thinks. This is an interesting thing. When we launched, we did an opinion survey and we asked the public, what is your opinion of renewable energy? And then we asked, what do you think public opinion is on renewable energy? And like every other survey ever done in the UK, 70 or 80% of people support renewable energy. But people thought that only about 5% of the public supported renewable energy. because I think that this is the message they're getting through the newspapers all the time, reinforced by politicians who are reading the same newspapers. And the third very quick point is about tribalism. So people's identity, your sense of identity is very important to you. What am I? What sort of person am I? And the problem, one of the problems with the sort of libertarian conservatism, sort of contrarianism, is that people of the right come to feel, well, I support free markets, I don't like regulation, and I don't do climate change because that's a left thing. And actually some of the new groups like Extinction Rebellion are also helping to fuel this separation, this idea that if I want to combat climate change, I am of the left. That's what left-leaning people do. It's quite a dangerous thing, I think, whether it's done by XR or whether it's done by the contrarians on the political right.
So one of the problems I think that has happened, at least particularly in the United States, has been the media. And I can give you an example of this. The first time I ever reported on disinformation, well, the first time I reported on disinformation, there's a movie out right now starring Mark Ruffalo about an attorney who discovered problems with a chemical. I reported on the very first document that came out of that in like 2005. And it was a document that laid out from that lawyer, Rob Bilott, how they're going to create disinformation around PFOA, a chemical used in nonstick products. And at the same time, I'd done a story about a guy named Michael Mann, who's a climate researcher, and why Congress began investigating him. And the way it operated was there'd been this sort of fake kind of story on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. When I looked into the background of it, the guy attacking him, Michael Mann, when I called his work where he had retired from, he still worked there. He didn't think I was going to call his work. And then where he'd published his research, I looked into this journal, and it was found in like 25 libraries worldwide. This thing called Energy and Environment, this crappy little journal. And I didn't know anything about climate science at the time. I knew that there was something weird happening with this guy, Michael Mann. Everything checked out with him. It seemed like he knew what he was doing. I didn't understand climate science that well. I just wrote this story like, there's this weird thing going on where they're going after this guy. And I was at a journalism conference some months afterwards, and I was sitting around in a group of people. We're huddled around, and I asked, like, what's going on with this climate science stuff? Like, I did a story with this guy, Michael Mann. It seemed to check out. Like, is this stuff real? Like, what's going on? And in a tight circle, everyone said yes. And then there was a woman who was from a newspaper out in the West somewhere, and she said, well, there's like a dozen of them that say it isn't real. Like, I've got all their numbers and contact information. You want to talk to them. We've got to put it in every one of our stories. And that really struck me because I was a guy who got my information about climate change from reading the newspapers. And what I knew was a lot of the scientists overstated things, they overplayed some of the evidence, and that's what I took from reading the media. And yet, when I get in a tight circle and I start talking to the reporters, they're all laughing and giggling, saying, this thing's real. There's 12 guys, that say it's not. And so part of the problem, I think, has been the way the media oftentimes goes after these issues. And the media, of course, they don't want to own that. They don't want to, take authority over that issue.
Yeah.
Well, if I can just connect to that, because there's research on precisely that issue of false balance, and it's a very tempting thing for the media to present both sides of the story.
Right.
But there are situations where there are no two sides, where the evidence is only on one side, and what you have on the other side is just political propaganda. And sometimes the media don't get that, and they fail in their job when they still create this fake balance, because we know, as you just said yourself, we know from experiments and empirical data that if you expose people to a balanced view, the readership will think that the debate is still open. Even a single dissenting voice in experiments is enough to introduce doubt about the consensus.
Can I say one more thing on that? I have a story that I'm just turned in that's coming out about disinformation in science. I tracked all the documents down. It's a group that's been funded by all the groups telling you that climate change is real. BP, Chevron, and Shell. None of them returned my calls for the story that's coming out. It's a group that operates, of course, out of the United States. Budget's $2 million a year. They're not happy that I have their documents, but, too bad. And when I called up people to talk about who've been attacked by this group, Naomi Oreskes at Harvard University, one of her students, Jeffrey Supran, and a guy named Ben Frant, who's now there's a woman named Lisa McKenzie who works on fracking. What Naomi said, which is kind of true, and I almost think that maybe this panel in many ways could help do this, when you talk about disinformation, you almost legitimize it because you put it out into people's heads that, hey, there's a controversy. So that's part of the problem. Even discussing information is a win for the companies. It's a win for disinformation. And I don't know where where you get that inflection point at which you stop talking about it. You know, that's the hard decision.
Yeah, Berna wants to comment on this.
Let me, can you hear? Yes. Let me defend the media, because I am from a serious media. If you talk like this, it's like talking about the immigrants are rapists, like Trump says. Scientists are moved by interest. I mean, you're doing the same as the fake news promoters do. There are media and there are media. I read yesterday some information from the United States, I'm sure you know it better than me, about a TV program in an important channel, I don't remember which one, that made a program, 7 hours program about the climate change and introduced all the political parties' views, etc. And it had very low audience. But all the bots and people linked to Trump, I think, and the Republican Party and lobbies started to tweet and move it in the net. And in the nets, in the social networks, it was up to the most important audience that they had ever seen. While the important debate in the television, and we are not talking about that television when you say media, was very low. So what I want to say is that, like now with Greta Thunberg, everybody says, you are using Greta Thunberg. That's one of the fake news that we are confronting these days. No, excuse me, in El País and in other important media in Spain, and the most important are more than the less important, are giving pages and pages and amounts of stories from islands that are disappearing, from Venecia and the climate change, and interviews with scientists. Tomorrow there will be a chronicle in El País about this. So we are making a huge effort to tell about the climate change. And when you talk about the media, you are putting in the same bag the rubbish and the good media, which are the majority.
Okay, that's a good point. Now I would like to ask our panelists about measures to fight disinformation on climate change. But because we are running out of time, I will give the floor to the public to make the questions. And at the same time, if you can answer this question of how to tackle the disinformation problem, I would be very thankful. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jorge from Sail to the COP, and I would like to address a question to Irene as a representative of the government and Berna as Deputy Director of El País. Irene, you said that we are in a hurry, we have to act right now, and that's at the same time, yesterday, the Climate Change Performance Index from New Climate came out and said that the Spanish national climate policy rates low. Then, continuing from the quotes, we have that you said that the people haven't put enough pressure on politicians, so putting the weight on the people. And now I'm swifting a bit from the nihilism to the part of greenwashing, which I believe is more dangerous, because the nihilism is saying no, and greenwashing is thinking we're doing the right thing, but we're not. Then there was Berna, you said 3 times, the problem is not the people that make fake news, the problem is the politicians that use them. So everybody puts the ball on someone else. Then you said that there is 93% of the population in Spain believe that human-made climate change is a fact.
We only have 5 minutes left. Could you do one question
Yes.
to one person? Because there are other 2 people that want to
All
make
right, I'll be
questions.
very quick then. I just want to say then that how can we trust the Spanish states where politicians are taking bribes in shapes of money or jobs from Endesa, the famous puertas giratorias that you might know, and if you're not from Spain, I invite you to research it. And how can we trust the papers when you're helping the greenwashers like Iberdrola and Endesa to take the lead on climate change, to take the lead literally only on the papers, as they continue to be the biggest polluters in our country? Thank you.
Well, that's not a question. Actually, it's an accusation, but I will try to answer very shortly. Thank you. You say that Spanish government is scoring low. The truth is that the plan for cutting emissions presented by Spanish government in the European Union has scored the first one. Of course, it is a plan, but this is a government that has been in office only for 1 year and a half. So we're doing our best. We know there are lots of things still to do. And I think that the fact that Spanish government has volunteered to organize this COP in Madrid is a clear proof of our commitment with the measures we need to take to combat climate change. Now I will give the floor to Berna.
I don't understand. I don't know if I understood the question. I mean, we talk about what we publish. We have published dozens of editorial comments, op-eds, reports about the necessity of the measures, and I don't know what to add. I mean, it's all published. That's the best. My best defense is that what we publish is what we say, and I never have any pressure or nothing. I mean, I just work with my journalists, and they research, they investigate, we publish. I don't know, maybe later we can concrete something more, because there are more words. I am open to it.
Yeah, there's another question there.
Yes, hello, Ricardo Fraguas for Radio Internacional de España. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me?
Sí, sí, sí.
Hello?
Sí, sí, sí.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. We've been able to regulate fake information, banning, as you mentioned, advertising from tobacco on our media. Do you believe it would be possible that even before we have regulation to ban also fake information through the advertising of combustion engine vehicles that are unhealthy for the people and also for the environment, that media, traditional media, even as respectful as El País, for example, and other television broadcasters and then papers, that voluntarily, before we have that regulation, we start also filtering this kind of messages from the companies, even before regulations? Thank you.
Thank you. I think Richard...
I don't think that so much is possible, but one interesting thing that's happening in the UK now is some people in the advertising industry are looking at basically, if a newspaper or a magazine publishes an article that is very denialist, then that a company is advertising in that same publication, to contact the advertiser and say, you know that your money has actually funded that piece of crap that's come out of there. So that's starting to happen, and I think it takes, for a while there's been that thing in the UK about newspapers that print anti-immigrant racist articles, and now that's moving over into climate change. But I think if I can just also enlarge on your question, how to change this. Personally, I don't think rules will work in journalism. For one thing, journalists have to report on what deniers say when deniers hold office. You can't not report what Trump says. You have to report what Trump says because he's the President of the United States. And if you actually try and work out where the rules would fall, it's very difficult. But what you can do is understand how journalism works and engage with journalists on that basis and editors. And if you go to an editor and say, you're printing this and it's factually wrong, they might not really care, actually, But if you show them that they're out of touch with their audience, that this is not what their audience wants, if you go to politicians and say, you're wrong, they might not particularly care. But if you go and say, this is going to lose you votes and this is why, that now you're using arguments that actually work with those people. So I have much more hope for that than I do for regulation.
Yeah, and the last question we're going to take is here.
Chen Weihua, China Daily. You know, you talk about fake news. I mean, my question is there, I mean, it's not really in the news actually, COP25. If you check, I mean, I don't know, sorry to say, BBC website, I read it today. I mean, it's not in the main page. I mean, you have CNN covering a shooting 24/7. BBC stopped programming to cover Hong Kong protest every hour. I mean, which station is going live cover the scientists talk, outcry for climate crisis emergency? No one seems to be interested. I think that's the problem. Why you think there is, you know, people are saying that climate change is Chinese hoax. I mean, people actually let them to, you know, tell that lie. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think Paul, yeah.
You know, the first time I wrote about, I was at a journal called Environmental Science and Technology, which is the top journal in environmental science. And that's when climate change was being covered as an environmental topic. And I've always felt it's going to, when it stops becoming an environmental topic, which it is right now, it's now a business story. It's a medical story. There was an op-ed in New England Journal of Medicine. The Lancet ran an entire huge story on the health effects of climate change. We're seeing it in other sections of the newspaper. It's broken out of the environmental science ghetto in the media and is now like a mainstream story. And to me, that's much more important than is CNN here covering a bunch of climate scientists telling me like what's happening with climate science. It's not a science story. It needs to stop being a science story. It's a general story.
100% agree with that. Completely right. It needs to come into business reporting. It is. Papers like the Financial Times have completely got this now. And by the way, COP25 is number 6 on the BBC website right now.
Okay, it has been a very interesting discussion. I hope you have enjoyed, and thank you very much to all the panelists. We have to finish now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was good.
It was